Hello, everyone, and welcome back to SpeakFlow Podcast. In our last episode, we talked about thinking directly in English instead of translating every sentence in our minds. Today, we are discussing another problem that almost every English learner experiences. You know the words, you know the grammar, you even understand movies and podcasts, but the moment someone asks you a question, your mind suddenly becomes empty. Why does this happen?
I believe this is one of the most misunderstood experiences in language learning. Most learners immediately think, I forgot everything, or my English is very weak. But in reality, they usually have not forgotten anything. Their brain simply cannot retrieve the information quickly enough under pressure.
That is interesting. So forgetting and failing to remember at the right moment are actually different things?
Exactly. Imagine a huge library with thousands of books. Every book is still there, but if the librarian needs 2 minutes to find the correct book while someone is waiting, it looks as if the library does not have it. Your brain works in a similar way.
That explains why I sometimes remember the perfect sentence 5 minutes after the conversation ends.
And that happens to millions of learners around the world. The information never disappeared. The retrieval process was simply too slow.
So the real question is not, why did I forget English, but why couldn't my brain access it at the right time?
Exactly. Cognitive psychologists call this retrieval failure rather than memory loss. Your knowledge exists, but the pathway to reach it is not automatic enough.
Many students say they can understand 90% of a YouTube video, but struggle to answer a simple question like, how was your day?
Because understanding and producing language activate different mental systems. Listening is recognition. Speaking is creation. Recognition is always easier than production.
That reminds me of recognizing a person's face, but forgetting their name.
That is actually a perfect comparison. Recognition requires much less mental effort than recall. Speaking English depends on recall.
So learners should stop blaming themselves every time they hesitate?
Absolutely. Hesitation is evidence that the brain is searching, not evidence that the brain knows nothing.
I think many listeners will find that reassuring.
And understanding the reason is the first step towards solving the problem.
Let me ask one more question. Why do some people speak perfectly when practicing alone, but suddenly struggle in front of another person?
Because conversation adds another mental task.
Your brain is no longer focusing only on language. It is also processing eye contact, reactions, confidence, social pressure, pronunciation, grammar, and meaning all at the same time. So speaking is actually multitasking.
Exactly. And whenever cognitive load increases, retrieval becomes slower.
That means forgetting English while speaking is often a processing problem rather than a learning problem.
Precisely. And once learners understand this difference, they stop chasing more vocabulary and start training faster retrieval.
That is a completely different way of looking at fluency. So far, we've discovered that many learners do not actually forget English. Their brains simply cannot retrieve the information fast enough. Now, let's go deeper. Emma, what is happening inside our brain when we suddenly become silent during a conversation?
To answer that, we need to understand a very important concept called working memory. Think of working memory as the brain's temporary workspace. It is the place where information is held and processed for a few seconds while we are performing a task. When you speak English, your working memory is doing many jobs at once. It is remembering vocabulary, organizing grammar, choosing pronunciation, understanding the other person, planning the next sentence, and monitoring whether your answer makes sense. All of this happens within seconds.
That sounds like a lot of work for the brain.
It is. In fact, psychologists often compare working memory to a small desk rather than a large library. The library contains everything you know, but the desk can only hold a few items at one time. When the desk becomes crowded, something falls off. In English conversation, that something is often the exact word you wanted to say.
So the word is still stored somewhere in the library, but there is no space to bring it onto the desk.
Exactly. That is why many learners say, I knew the word yesterday, or I remembered it after the conversation ended. The memory never disappeared. The brain simply could not access it under pressure.
Many students immediately blame their vocabulary. They think they need another 1,000 words. Is that really the solution?
Surprisingly, no. Research shows that many intermediate learners already know enough vocabulary for everyday conversation. Their biggest challenge is automatic retrieval, not vocabulary size. Knowing 3,000 words and using them quickly is far more useful than memorizing 10,000 words that you cannot access.
That changes the way we think about learning. Instead of collecting more words, we should practice using the words we already know.
Exactly. Language learning is much more about building strong connections than collecting isolated information. Every time you actively use a word, the neural pathway becomes stronger. Every time you avoid speaking, that pathway remains weak.
I have noticed something else. When I speak with a friend, I feel relaxed. But when I speak with a teacher or in an interview, I suddenly forget simple English. Why does confidence affect memory?
That is another fascinating area of psychology. When people become nervous, the brain activates its stress response. Stress hormones increase alertness, which is useful in dangerous situations, but they reduce the efficiency of working memory. The brain begins focusing on possible mistakes instead of producing language naturally. Instead of thinking, what do I want to say? The learner starts thinking, what if I make a mistake? What if my pronunciation is wrong? What if people laugh? Every one of these thoughts occupies valuable mental space.
So anxiety is competing with English for attention.
Emma, there is something I still don't fully understand. If learners already know English words and they already understand grammar, then why do they still struggle in real conversation?
That's a very important question. The main reason is that knowing English and using English are controlled by different mental systems. When you read or listen, your brain has time. It can pause, analyze, and understand. But in speaking, everything must happen instantly. There is no pause button in real conversation.
So speaking is more about speed than knowledge?
Exactly. Most learners think fluency means knowing more English, but in reality, fluency means accessing English faster. If your brain takes 5 seconds to find a word, conversation breaks. Even if your English is correct, it still feels slow.
That explains why people often say, I know this word, but I can't remember it right now.
Yes, and that is a retrieval issue, not a knowledge issue. Your brain stores information in long-term memory, but speaking requires fast access from working memory. If that connection is weak, the word feels lost in the moment.
Is this why practice is more important than studying?
Exactly. Studying increases knowledge, but practice increases speed. Every time you actively use English, your brain strengthens the pathway between thought and speech. Over time, that pathway becomes automatic.
So repetition is not just memorization, it's actually training speed?
Yes, and this is where many learners make a mistake. They think repeating vocabulary silently is enough, but real improvement happens when you force your brain to retrieve English under small pressure. Even simple activities like describing your day in English can train the system. I also noticed something. When I speak alone, I feel confident, but when someone listens, everything becomes slow. That's a very common experience. The presence of another person adds what we call cognitive pressure. Your brain starts monitoring your performance instead of focusing only on communication. It begins asking questions like, am I correct? Did I pronounce that well? Will I make a mistake? These extra thoughts take up mental space, and that reduces fluency.
So confidence is not just emotional, it's also mental space management practice?
Exactly. Confident speakers are not thinking less because they know more. They are thinking less about judgment and more about...
Emma, if speaking English is really about speed and retrieval, then what is the best way for learners to actually improve it in real life? Because many people study for years but still don't see improvement in speaking.
The key shift is moving from passive learning to active recall. Most learners spend their time reading, listening, or memorizing. These are useful, but they don't train the brain to respond quickly. To improve speaking, the brain must practice retrieving English under real-time conditions.
So just consuming English is not enough?
Exactly. Consumption builds understanding, but production builds fluency. You only become fluent when your brain is forced to produce English without preparation. For example, if I ask you, what did you do yesterday? And you answer immediately in English, that moment is training your retrieval system.
That makes sense. But many learners feel pressure when they try to speak like that. They stop because they were afraid of making mistakes.
And that fear is one of the biggest barriers because the brain interprets fear as a signal to slow down and become more careful. But careful thinking reduces speed, and speed is essential for fluency. Mistakes are not a failure in this process. They are actually part of building faster connections.
So mistakes are part of learning speed, not signs of weakness?
Exactly. Every mistake shows the brain where to improve. Every correction strengthens the pathway for future use. Fluent speakers are not people who avoid mistakes. They are people who continue speaking despite mistakes.
I think that is a very important mindset shift for learners.
Yes, and once learners accept this, their speaking improves naturally because they stop blocking themselves mentally. Another important habit is thinking in simple English during daily life, not complex grammar, just simple sentences like, I am going outside, I need to finish this work, I feel tired today. This trains the brain to reduce translation and increase direct thinking.
So fluency is built in small daily moments, not only in classrooms.
Exactly. Fluency is not something you suddenly achieve. It is something you slowly build through repeated exposure, repetition, and real usage. And over time, the brain starts responding automatically instead of searching.
That actually makes English learning feel more achievable.
It is achievable. The key is consistency, not intensity. Even a few minutes of daily speaking practice is more powerful than hours of passive study once a week.
So the message is simple. Don't wait for perfect English. Start using the English you already have.
Exactly.
Fluency begins when you stop waiting and start. I think today's discussion really helped us understand why English disappears in real conversations and how it can be improved step by step.
Yes, and the most important takeaway is that fluency is built through practice, not perfection. Every small attempt counts.
To everyone listening, remember, you don't need perfect English to start speaking. You just need to start.
Exactly. Keep practicing a little every day, and your fluency will grow naturally over time.
Thank you for being with us today.